Israel just entered the biggest recession it has ever witnessed since its inception onto Palestinian lands in 1948. This while over 2 million Israelis have lost income, meaning that many middle-class families will be reduced to poverty and food aid. For the first time since 2009, Israel has entered an economic recession after its gross domestic product collapsed by 28.7% on an annualized basis in the second fiscal quarter of 2020.
Every day that people are not working and the economy is stuck, we're losing 1.5 billion shekels.
So yeah, I was actually, you're saying 1.5 billion shekels is the cost of quarantine per day?
Yes. It's the cost of no consumerism, okay?
Sure.
Remember, consumerism is the main thing that gets the economy going. People are not buying anything besides food. And the government is losing income tax because there's no activity.
There are over 1 million unemployed Israelis. More Israelis are expected to lose their jobs. Many others will lose their apartments and businesses, according to Israeli media. Many sectors in Israel, including high-tech companies, are finding it very hard, if not impossible, to raise capital, exposing the key sector's dependence on international funds. This while 2 million Israelis have reported a loss of income due to COVID-19, according to a new study by the Israel Democracy Institute. According to the Central Bureau of Statistics, the collapse came after a 6.8% fall in GDP in the first fiscal quarter of 2020. Private consumption also fell by 44.2%. This means consumption by Israelis almost fell by half due to a collapse in the economy. So far, this year business output fell by 33.4%. This while imported goods dropped by 41.7%. Income from leisure activities and cultural events crashed by 80%. This sector had the harshest crash. The Central Bureau of Statistics has reported that due to a lack of data on the various factors involved, the figures might be higher and can be adjusted later on. A recession is the most severe kind of economic crisis. It means that the economy shrinks in terms of GDP for at least 2 successive quarters. Research published by the Bank of Israel highlights indications that the activity of the high-tech sector has been adversely impacted, as has been the ability of the sector to raise capital. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, hundreds of thousands of Israelis have lost their jobs, and the crisis is hitting the poor and young people the hardest, worsening inequalities. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected the news, saying that Israel is in a less than deep recession as compared with other countries.
רוצים להגיע למצב שאנשים יודעים איך אנחנו חיים בשנה הקרובה. זה לא יהיה מלא, זה לא יפתור את כל הבעיות, זה לא יכסה את כל האובדן, אבל זה צריך לתת רשת ביטחון. עכשיו שאלת שאלה טובה, שנייה. אנחנו יודעים שאנחנו צריכים גם להתאים.
One of the issues cited by the Central Bureau of Statistics is that the jump in regime spending hit 25.2% in the second quarter. Back in July, Netanyahu backed more welfare spending. One of the reasons that Israel went into a recession, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics, is the sharp jump in regime spending.
If you go in the streets of any major city in Israel, you can see one after another shops with the sign "closed down" on its front or "for rent" at its front. Tens of thousands of shops have closed down in big cities, but also in small towns and villages. This is a tremendous social problem because behind any one of these stores, there is a family that lost its income. There are workers who are now sent off to unemployment, and government can provide small business owners and small shop owners with adequate compensation. But up until now, it has failed to do that. Up until now, the only compensation the government has provided for small businesses and shop owners was a result of protest and a result of pressure on the street. So it seems that more protest and more pressure on the street is needed for our government to turn the resources that are needed in order to stop this social catastrophe from aggravating even more. The past few months have shown that Netanyahu responds to pressure. Several times since the outbreak of the coronavirus crisis, there were protests, mass protests, by the unemployed, or by small business owners, or by students, or by restaurant owners, or by workers from the tourism industry. Netanyahu has responded every single time to the pressures put out by these people protesting on the street. So Netanyahu can respond, but only if we're out, striking, demonstrating, raising our voices, protesting, linking ours together with other people, other communities, other groups who have demands in order to pressure Netanyahu into submission and into surrendering to our just demands.
ממשמר הירדן, בגליל העליון. אני בת 50.
כיצד את מושפעת מהמיתון הכלכלי האחרון שיש בישראל?
אני אישית לא מושפעת, אבל הילדים שלי. יש לי ילדים סטודנטים שהם בבעיה כי הם צריכים להמשיך לשלם שכר דירה ואין להם איך, אין להם עבודות. אז לא פשוט לתמוך גם בילדים וגם להחזיק משפחה.
ישראלים מוחים כי רוצים עזרה כספית מהממשל. האם לדעתך עליהם לקבל עזרה כספית מהרשויות?
אני חושבת שכן, זה הזמן של הרשויות לעזור. בשביל זה אנחנו משלמים מיסים, כדי שיוכלו לעזור עכשיו למי שאפשר.
שמי עינת ליכטינגר, אני דוקטור עינת ליכטינגר, אני מטבעון, אני שייכת למעגל עומדים ביחד של נצרת והעמק. אנחנו נמצאים פה היום עשרות, מעל 100 איש, כדי למחות על המצב הכלכלי והמצב החברתי שבו נמצאת המדינה כרגע, על המצוקה שכולנו סובלים ממנה פה בצפון. יהודים וערבים כאחד, באותם מצוקות, באותם כאבי לב, באותם קשיים גם כלכליים וגם חברתיים קשים.
כיצד את מושפעת אישית מהמיתון הכלכלי האחרון שנמצא בישראל?
תראה, באופן אישי אני לא מושפעת, אבל כל החברים שלי והאנשים מסביבי והילדים שלי ואנשים רבים מסביב פגועים בצורה בלתי רגילה, וזה מגיע לשכבות שהן שכבות מאוד מבוססות בדרך כלל. מעבר לזה, אני לא יכולה להיות אדישה למצוקה שיש מסביב. אי אפשר להתעלם מזה כשאנחנו חיים עכשיו בסביבה שיש בה כל כך הרבה מובטלים, כל כך הרבה אנשים שאין להם אוכל, כל כך הרבה אנשים שסובלות בבתים, כל כך הרבה אנשים שהם במצוקה. גם אם אני לא סובלת אישית, זה משהו שהוא חונק אותנו, גומר, הרגשה נוראית.
הרבה ישראלים מוחים על עזרה כספית. האם לדעתך עליהם לקבל עזרה כספית מהרשויות?
החוכמה היא למצוא דרך, לבנות תוכנית כלכלית של רווחה, של נאורות, של חשיבה, כל הדברים שאין כרגע בממשלה הזאת, ולפתח אפשרויות לאנשים לעבודה, אנשים פה של התיירות, שצריך למצוא להם אלטרנטיבות, ואף אחד אחרי חצי שנה לא התחיל לחשוב מה עושים איתם. החוכמה היא לא רק לתת כסף, צריך לתת כסף, אבל החוכמה היא גם לבנות איזושהי תוכנית, איזושהי ראייה לטווח ארוך, וזה מה שחסר פה.
On social media, the recession was not taken so lightly. According to Gilbert, Netanyahu the spender leaves a deficit budget, depriving the means of stimulus to counterbalance the effects of coronavirus, whereas to rule is to foresee and not to head forward to avoid justice. Yehiel replies to Netanyahu himself, telling him, "Stupid is whoever believes in you." Eyal believes Netanyahu is disconnected and that he should go out to the streets and see what's happening. Fizz tells Netanyahu that your and Trump's graphs are the same graphs, only you do not stutter when you lie. Asaf says that Israel's economy is crashing and it's because of one man, a crook who holds us hostage and does to us as he pleases.
I think the government is using and deploying actions that there's no medical agreement that are necessary to combat the new infections, which is in a way kind of upsetting because I'm happy to cooperate with any measures that have a rationale behind it, and I'm not convinced that this specifically does.
According to the Israeli NGO called Latet, 2.3 million of Israelis are poor, among them 530,000 families and 1 million Israeli children. Among these, the Israeli children who receive support from the state to have meals, about 76.3% receive for food in school carbohydrates, breads or bread. They don't receive protein. And 54.5% receive either they skip meals or they eat only partial meals.
According to a study by the Israel Democracy Institute, 2 million Israelis have reported a loss of income due to COVID-19. This includes almost 20% of business owners who had to close either temporarily and 53% of Israelis between the ages of 18 to 24 who suffered a decline in earnings. Overall, a third of Israelis have suffered a loss of income. The study arrives on the heels of another one by Lated, the Israeli humanitarian aid organization. According to the Jerusalem Post, Lated said middle-class Israeli families are 2 years away from poverty and that the real effects of the recession will only be felt in 2021. Some families might require food aid within 7 months, the report said. Even in families where one breadwinner is able to maintain his or her job, poverty might be unavoidable. The unemployment rate has crept up to 21.1% in August, the Employment Service said, from 20.9% in July. This while 1 out of 5 Israelis has reduced their food expenditures during the coronavirus crisis, while requests for aid increased 116%, Lated reported. To prevent the middle class from shrinking, many economists say there must be stable sources of steady income. Unfortunately, due to Israel's ongoing political, social, and economic crises, securing such resources seems impossible for now.
I think that the economic situation of people doesn't need to be politicized because it is already political. The question of whether we can make ends meet is a political question. The question of whether we can have enough money to pay rent or to pay back a loan to the bank is a political question. The question of whether we have work the next months, the next year is a political question. So the economic situation need not be politicized because it is already deeply political question. The question is, will this social protest movement? Will this economic crisis as a result of the coronavirus, will it impact the political system? Will we see a change in the coming elections? Will we see a shift in power between Netanyahu into other parts of the political spectrum? This is a question that yet to be seen, but the only answer to that will be given by the people. Whether they will continue to protest, whether they will organize, whether they will create political structures that can change the balance of power between the people and the elite in power. What's different about the recent wave of protest in Israel is that the fact that on the one hand you have many sectors of the working people that are protesting and going on a strike. It has been unseen in the past few years that so many workers and trade unions and sectors went on strike and went on protest one after the other in such a short consecutive period of time for just a few months. The other interesting feature of the recent protest against the government is that it targets Netanyahu personally and his rule. People name names, people point fingers. Contrary to the social protest movement in 2011, now Netanyahu is seen for what he is, a culprit, a criminal, someone who doesn't provide the necessary steps to be taken for the welfare and the social protection of the majority of the people in Israel. This is an interesting and important development. What's needed now is to broaden the scope, to link up more sectors of the Israeli society for a protest that puts the problems of the people at its core and the change in political direction as its target.
נתניהו לדעתך מנהל את המערכת הפיננסית טוב בעיניו?
ממש לא. אין ניהול מהתחלת המשבר עד עכשיו, אין שום ניהול. יש בקושי כיבוי שריפות. ורואים את זה כי זה משבר כלכלי גדול לכל המדינה.
אוקיי. האם את מושפעת מעליית מחירים? ואם כן, אז איך?
לא, לא ממש מושפעת כי יש מיתון אז לא קונים. קונים ממש רק מה שצריך. לא יוצאים לחופש, לא עושים שום דבר, רק באמת חיים במינימום.
הטייקונים ישלמו! האם את מושפעת מהאבטלה ומהמשבר הכלכלי בכלל הנוכחי ואיך?
לא, אני אישית אין לי בעיה כי אני אחות, אז אני עובדת. מבחינת עבודה אני עובדת, אבל כמו שאמרתי, הילדים שלי קשה להם, כי הם סטודנטים, וקשה להם להתפרנס בימים אלה, וגם להמשיך ללמוד.
האם לדעתך נתניהו מנהל את המערכת הפיננסית טוב?
המערכת הפיננסית קורסת, רק עכשיו התפטר ראש התקציבים, לא שאני מסכימה עם התפיסה שלו, אבל מה שהוא תיאר זה מצב איום ונורא של פופוליזם, של חוסר ארגון. יש קריסה מוחלטת של הממשלה בכל תחום, גם הכלכלי, גם הבריאותי, אפילו הביטחוני. זאת אומרת, שום דבר לא מתנהל. מה שנתניהו עסוק זה רק עם המשפט שלו, זה הדבר היחיד שמעסיק אותו ומעניין אותו, וזה הדבר, ככה כולנו בני ערובה.
האם את מושפעת מעליית המחירים, ואם כן, אז איך?
שוב, כולנו בסירה אחת, זה לא עניין אישי, זה סיפור של האנשים סביבי, והמצוקה מסביב בולטת בכל יישוב שבו נמצאים. אי אפשר להמשיך להתעלם ממה שקורה מסביב, ולכן אנחנו פה.
The issue of Israel's economy was further highlighted online. Danny asks, Israel booming economy? Lated painted picture of poverty in Israel even bleaker than recently released official figures. Norienon says, little is known about the Israeli Jews suffering in Israel under their right-wing regime, children being taken from parents. An estimated 200 fathers a year have killed themselves. Arugidin says, as coronavirus infections surge in Israel, opinion polls showed confidence in Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was falling. He now faces nationwide protests led by young Israelis over the state of the economy. Duff says that a corrupted prime minister leads Israel to economic collapse. Business leaders must speak out now. Netanyahu uses dictatorship brutality against his people and is putting his own well-being ahead of Israeli people, destroys an amazing economy.
government decision is not helping us at all. It's for them to be able to sit in their chairs and not really to solve the problem. And it goes like this for a long time, and people are not, we don't feel anybody really cares about us.
Most recently, in the past year, for the first time in 7 years of relative growth, Israel's inequality rate is the highest. It grew once again, is once again on the rise. And while the upper echelons of society are making more than before, the lower echelons of society are making less than before, while for the middle class, for various sectors, the wages have been frozen, and the cost of living is extremely high for the vast majority of the middle class.
ראש הממשלה, איך אתה מרגיש?
Israel is now in a recession. Many in Israel believe that the regime is only making it worse. The root of the problem did not begin with the COVID-19 epidemic in Israel, but way before, during the political deadlock that some argue is still ongoing. Israel went through 2 failed elections since April 2019. Even this latest third one didn't work out until a coalition deal was formed between Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his opponent Benny Gantz. Some say the deadlock is still there, citing the fact that the two still haven't agreed on a budget for 2020. Now, Israel is facing a situation with hundreds of thousands of unemployed, and on the other hand, employers are desperate for assistance to kickstart their work. But as the Israeli regime uses populist policies and takes what protesters call unhelpful measures, the situation will only worsen for the most vulnerable. Here is the news making the press in Israel. Ynet News. Israel is in a recession and the regime is making it worse. Israel is in a deep and potentially long-term recession and the regime's response is not helping, according to Omer Moav, a professor of economics at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. According to Moav, Israel is at the beginning of an unusually deep recession and must be prepared for it to last for a long while. The Jerusalem Post. Israelis are more pessimistic about Israel's future and democracy. According to the Israeli Voice Index for August 2020, more than half of Israelis, that is 52.4%, are pessimistic about the future of Israel. More than 2/3, that is 68.4%, think that the days of the current regime are numbered, anticipating a 4th round of elections. The Times of Israel. The Israeli regime backed down from previous plans to lock down some 40 cities with high coronavirus infection numbers. Instead, in a bid to appease ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities in Israel, the regime scraps full closure plan in favor of curfew between 7 p.m. and 5 a.m. in 40 red cities. Globes. The Ministry of Finance said that as of the end of August, the budget deficit over the past 12 months widened to 8.1% of GDP from 7.2% at the end of July. The deficit has continued widening since the coronavirus crisis took hold, from 4.8% at the end of April, 4% at the end of March, and 3.1% at the end of February.